Good morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School, and welcome to our final Business Over Breakfast for 2024. And thank you for joining us today. Happy to close out this year with a very familiar face to many of you, Professor Tom Smith, the original instigator and faculty guide for Business Over Breakfast when it debuted in April of 2020. Doesn't seem like that long ago, but that is 4 years, 4.5 years.
It will be in a minute. It'll be 5 years.
In a minute, it'll be 5 years. Tom's focus today is to help us sort things out that are top of mind as we close out 2024 and prepare for a new year. There are lots of questions in our minds given transitions to new political landscapes in the US and elsewhere around the globe. So today we have the opportunity to get some insight into what effect the economy, both local and global, will have on our personal lives, our work lives, our companies, and our communities. As we turn the corner into 2025, some of the questions that come to mind are, who will the winners and losers be next year? Is the economy expanding or contracting? What will happen if tariffs get implemented? Is it a good time to change jobs, hire new people? And what's going on with inflation? It seems to be very resistant to coming down. So Tom Smith, as our faculty guide, is a finance faculty member here at Goizueta Business School who teaches in our Finance for Non-Financial Managers course, as well as our Chief Medical Officer program, amongst many others. He is an expert in labor economics, pricing, financing, the economics of entertainment, sports, and healthcare. He's a sought-after thought leader by media outlets like CNN, MSNBC, National Public Radio, and others. And he's frequently quoted in the press regarding trends in unemployment, inflation, trade, and economics-driven topics. Before I hand over to Tom, I do want to suggest that given everything that 2025 might throw at us and our organizations, that you consider learning as one of your New Year's resolutions. Having recently participated in our new Navigating Change course, I can certainly vouch firsthand for the benefit of taking a few days to invest in your own learning. So alongside lose weight, get fit, think about invest in my learning. So today, Tom is going to spend some time giving his insights into the economy. Please, we want this to be as interactive as possible, answer as many of your questions as possible. So please put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as possible. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you so much, Nicola. I really appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. A little chilly morning, but very happy to be here. As Nicola mentioned, I had come up with this idea right at the beginning of the pandemic because I thought that the information that people were hearing about the economy wasn't quite robust enough. The economy was changing very, very quickly. And I just didn't think that there were sources of information that were being given to people at the pace that things were changing. And so we were doing this, I think, every Thursday for most of the spring before I handed the baton off to a lot of my colleagues who have now done some amazing programs. So welcome. This morning, we're going to talk about the current state of the economy. I'm going to show you a handful of graphs and figures, talk about some things that are happening, and then open it up for Q&A. I'm very happy to have lots of questions about what's going on. I'll give you my opinion. The idea here is to get a better sense about where we are going forward here. So let me open this up. This presentation, give me a second here as this thing comes together. So you got to think about the current state of the economy. I'm always reading about the economy, and of course, I'm teaching the economy to students in the undergraduate programs and the graduate programs at Emory. I'm teaching them to our physicians and radiologists in the healthcare industry, and of course, I do lots of programs with people for CEO roundtables and community groups as well, because the economy is so darn important. So let me give you some highlights here of what's happening. So I think the economy is performing well, but perhaps not well enough. Now, why would I say that? Those of you keeping track would have noticed that the Fed decreased federal funds target rate by a quarter point yesterday. Why did they do that, and what other things are going on? Well, the unemployment rate is still very, very low, although it has been trending upward slightly the last 4 to 5 months. So it's at 4.2%, up from 4.1. That doesn't necessarily concern me. The overall trend is maybe a little concerning. We'll talk about that. We are breaking records, although I noticed that this is not the good kind. We hit 10 consecutive days of Dow Jones losses. The record goes all the way back to the Ford administration. Not great losses, not great losses. So the Dow Jones was down, but we're still up for the year. And the losses that we saw were very, very small. We're not talking about 200 and 500 point losses. They were very, very small. Yet, I think that there's a trend there that might point to some hesitancy of participants in the market. Inflation is being a little stubborn. We hear all the time that the Fed is targeting this 2% inflation rate. It's part of the thing called the Taylor rule. And the Fed is targeting 2%. We are above 2%, but we are we're hovering actually a little bit closer to about 3%. We will have to keep an eye on that, especially with the Fed engaging in expansionary monetary policy. So, in case you weren't paying attention yesterday, because a lot of things were going on, the government will run out of money midnight on Saturday. So, what does this mean? We've got budget resolutions. They've been kicking the can down the road, so to speak. And just yesterday, the president-elect and Elon Musk sent out X's or tweets or other social media reports to Congress saying, you should trash the current deal. And it looks like Congress might be taking them up on that suggestion. Credit card rates and mortgage rates are not coming down with federal funds rate. I talk on the media quite a bit about this. Yes, these rates move in concert with the mortgage rates, with the federal funds rate, but they're not moving down at the same clip. And so we're going to talk about that. Let's just do some overall analysis, looking at some statistics here so you can get a sense about what's going on, a quick pulse on the economy, if you will. So here is our market. This is the Dow Jones Industrial. Typically, I would show the S&P 500. Again, the market is up for the year. It's been an amazing year, and people who are holding stocks like NVIDIA will say it's just even amazing, just even more amazing than that. But I did want you to look at these whole bunch of pink, red, if you will, candles at the end of this trend. That's the 10 days in a row. Again, you'll notice that the losses are not quite large. These candles aren't huge, right? There's not a huge drop in the value of the Dow Jones, and these are just our blue chip stocks. But still, I think this points to a larger potential problem. So one of the things that we have to consider is that the market might be in the mood for a correction, or investors might be in the mood for a correction. Some firms have grown substantially, and the value of them have grown substantially, and they may be outpacing some of their, let's say, financial fundamentals. And as a result, there might be a correction in the works. I'm not sure how big of a correction. We may have seen something in the neighborhood of a 1 or 2 point correction, or 1 or 2 percentage correction recently. If the government does shut down, and that continues all the way through sometime in January, when now President-elect Trump becomes President Trump again, I think the market will see a significant correction, maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of 5% or 7%. I think we have to keep an eye on that. The market in general does not like the unknown. I think the market is okay with whatever the known is, right? And we did not see the market move in any significant way after the election, because I think there was some elements that were definitely baked in. And it wasn't a contentious election in terms of the vote counting. So I thought that the markets, indicated, okay, we know who the new president's going to be. That's fine. We're just going to carry on. But this kind of unknown, I think, is very, very unattractive to a lot of investors. And so if the government does shut down, so if they do not come with a new budget resolution sometime before Saturday, things will start shutting down. And what does that mean? It means TSA is going to be, those TSA lines are going to be longer. National parks will shut down. Some government employees will be furloughed, although they always get their money back, but it might come, a month or 2 months later. So I think the market may be reflecting some of that. We'll see what happens the next couple of days, literally the next couple of days, and then we'll get at least two trading days next week before the holidays. So if the government doesn't come up with a plan, we could see some nasty, nasty movements in the market. Let's go to the next thing here. Whoops. I mentioned the Fed. Decreased federal funds rate by 1/4 point yesterday. So that is a full 100 basis points going back, about the last 3 months. That's a pretty significant movement from the Fed, and that's pretty significant given that the Fed had been holding pat for a while. Of course, the Fed, which the Federal Reserve Bank, is controlling the money supply and setting the federal funds target by moving money in and out of the Federal Reserve banking system. And so when the Fed is seeing that the economy needs a boost, if you will, then the Fed is going to, push more money into the economy, and that will lower the federal funds rate and should have an impact on other interest rates. So the Fed is doing this. The Fed has been engaging in expansionary monetary policy because they're seeing some cracks in the economy. So everybody has been talking, and a lot of economists have been talking about how the economy hit a soft landing, or how the Fed's achieved a soft landing, which is, the way I envision it is some kind of small airplane is in distress, and instead of tumbling to the earth and crashing, they find a cornfield, and maybe they destroy their landing gear or they destroy a bunch of corn, but everybody's okay. The plane's in one piece. And so instead of avoiding a huge crash, you come down and you find someplace a little secure. Maybe it's not perfect, but nobody has been, significantly injured, right? That's the way that I'm thinking about this. It is very possible that these Fed moves recently, this 100 basis point decrease, is an indication that they want to preserve the soft landing, or that they saw that the soft landing could turn into an economic recession. So the Fed is making these moves. They never make any moves unless there is a very good reason to do so. So the Fed's expansionary monetary policy is an indication that they saw some cracks in the economic foundation, if you will. So there's a potential, though, and the potential is that the more money that you have in the economy, we're going to have inflationary pressures. So we have to keep an eye on that. Inflation is already not completely under control, at least as far as the Fed is concerned. It hasn't hit their 2% target. So that's something that we got to pay attention to. Unemployment is really, really low. This summer, we matched a 28-month in a row sub 4% unemployment record set all the way back in 1967, 68. I'm big on these economic records, as you can tell. And then the unemployment rate basically skipped above 4%, and it's still hovering just slightly above 4%. I don't know if this recent trend, this upward trend in the unemployment rate, is too awfully troubling. You'll notice here at the end of this, starting in October of 2022 or October 2023, the rate has just been sort of trickling upward. I'm not as concerned about that. I'd be much more concerned if it was a very, very rapid increase. But I think the Fed is paying attention to this, and they're certainly paying attention to the fact that there has been this labor mismatch. There's been a mismatch between employers and employees going back to right at the beginning of the pandemic. So people have been quiet quitting, although I have not heard people use that term now for about 6 months. I don't know if people are still doing it, but they had been doing it. They had been going to a job and looking for new jobs while at that other job. The labor market is very, very sticky, and labor force participation is still considerably lower than where it was prior to the pandemic. So I think a lot of firms have made adjustments and are trying to perform the same level of output with fewer people or less productive people. But there's no doubt that the labor market is still a little bit off. And we're seeing this tick up in the unemployment rate. What I would be looking for an indication if the economy is really going into a recession would be much more dramatic jumps in the unemployment rate. So from 4.1 to 4.2, and then to 4.5 to 4.7. Several jumps in a row, consecutive months, 4.7 to 4.9, 4.9 to 5.2. If I saw 2 months like that, then I would throw my hat into we're in a recession ring, if you will. Okay. Let's talk about the
Tom,
GDP. Yes.
sorry, we've got a few comments and
Right.
questions in the chat. So
Absolutely.
Sumit says, what will the biggest challenge for President-elect Mr. Trump be as he takes office?
The biggest
And
economic. I know that you're reading
yeah,
his.
let's leave it to economic challenge.
So I, I do think that the labor market is a significant economic challenge. I don't know what policies can be implemented to try to fix this mismatch between employers and employees. And we've seen this for all 3.5 years. That's a real challenge. And I cannot stress how much of a challenge it is, because if you're a firm trying to hire workers, it's a challenge to find workers who are productive. Once upon a time, you would use large gaps in your work history as a signal of a lack of productivity or maybe a change in productivity. But now employers can't even use those gaps, because the gaps could be could be caused by any number of structural changes in the market. So I don't think that those are really accurate. I think the
Mm-hmm.
labor market is the biggest challenge out there, but I do not know the kind of policies. I do not think the president of the United States can affect those policies directly. The other
Mm-hmm.
kind of challenges that the president will face um, I think, this notion that the United States is going to return to some manufacturing powerhouse. That's just not our strength in the US economy. And part of that is because our labor is much more expensive than it is in Mexico, China, Vietnam, India, any number of places, Brazil, Argentina. So these other countries can take advantage of their low wages, and they will have a comparative advantage in any good that is labor intensive in terms of its production. As a result, the United States, will focus on the areas of production where we do have our comparative advantages. But that doesn't mean that the people who are losing their jobs because firms are relocating their manufacturing to India or Vietnam, it doesn't mean that they're not going to be hurting. They will. I think that's a real challenge. So there's probably going to be a realization that it's not very easy to become a manufacturing powerhouse given the level of our wages relative to our international counterparts. That's going to be a challenge, because our economy has been in pivot mode for quite a while, and we're going to continue to be in pivot mode. So I think those things are for me front and center, but I don't know the kind of policies that the administration will evaluate to try to tackle those things. Was there a second question, or was there
Yeah,
another?
well, there is other questions and also a comment. Maureen does say that as a career coach, people are definitely still quiet quitting. So she's
Oh,
hearing
okay.
that obviously
I just hadn't. No, that's
firsthand.
nice. Thank you, Maureen. I hadn't heard that term for about 6 months. I didn't. Maybe they're
Mhm.
still doing it. Maybe they're just calling it something else. And so I think everybody was saying quiet quitting, and then they stopped using that terminology. But yeah, I think you're right. I would be curious to talk to her maybe do a panel at some point. I I've worked with a lot of companies in terms of putting together their job descriptions, and I do some recruiting for companies and help them with recruiting. And it's very, very challenging to find people who actually fit the job description, because a lot of people will just throw their resume up for anything. Say,
Mhm.
"Oh, yeah, I know how technology works, so I'm going to apply for this chief technology officer job." Like, I don't think really quite qualified. And if you're HR and you're reading through those, you might have to go through a lot of chaff to get to the wheat there. And I suspect that is, from my HR colleagues, that is one of the big challenges, is that they'll see 20 or 30 resumes or CVs that are just completely bananas
Right.
relative to what they're actually advertising or looking for.
Yeah. Gary asks, when you're talking about unemployment, is there an age breakdown on the unemployment level? So is it significantly different across age groups?
Yeah, and the real big breakdown, Gary, is the education groups. So there's almost no unemployment in people who have a bachelor's degree and above. That unemployment is less than 2%, and above, for people who have less than a college education, then the unemployment starts increasing quite significantly. But it's not as big a the gap as it has been, but there is a big gap. There's also an age breakdown, as you mentioned. So your 19 to 26-year-olds typically have a little bit higher unemployment rate than your 30 to, let's say, 49-year-olds. And it breaks down by race and gender as well. So African American males, higher unemployment than Hispanic females, if you will. So I don't have that chart here. What I think is actually equally as fascinating is the labor force participation rate. Labor force participation is capturing the entrance back into the workforce of people who are eligible to work. And what we saw after COVID was the labor force participation rate tank and actually fall down. And then we've seen white males almost get back to where they were prior to the pandemic, but not quite. White females have fallen below and stayed below their labor force participation prior to the pandemic. Hispanic males and Hispanic females have actually exceeded their labor force participation relative to where the pandemic was. And African American males and African American females are back to where they were and slightly above. So what's happened is that white males and white females have actually left the workforce, and other groups have taken on more of those responsibilities. But those also break down by age as well. So a lot of people who early retired, if you will, or people who decided to do something else. There's a large number of people who are living off the grid a little bit, maybe not physically off the grid in some trailer in a campground somewhere, but like literally off the grid in terms of employment, where they're not officially working, but maybe they're day trading, maybe they're living off of savings. Although, to tell you the truth, the savings has been depleted. All the savings that we built up during COVID, that's all gone. So there was a report about a month and a half ago that the savings from COVID is all but extinct at this point. So, you want me to answer some more questions or go with
Yeah, we've got some
statistics?
more. So
Yeah.
let me give you a couple more. Brian asks, the labor market and capital markets are two distinct separate constructs. Can you speak to how one impacts the other?
So it's more along the lines of, I think about it as the capital market is influences the labor market in some considerable ways. But these markets are very, very intertwined, as you have pointed out. So the thing about the capital market like this, IKEA goes down to West Point, Georgia, and builds billion-dollar manufacturing plants, right? I mean, that's a big part of capital. It's not a capital market per se, but that's foreign direct investment. But that is that they're doing that. IKEA is investing in West Point, Georgia, and throwing a bunch of capital into that area because they know that there is a workforce just south of Georgia that is readily accessible. And if given an opportunity, an amazing job, they would jump at the chance. And I've only heard good things about people who are working for IKEA. And we've seen other companies that are doing this, that are taking advantage of, let's say, rural workforces. So the capital will oftentimes flow into areas if there is available labor. You might be thinking about, okay, how does the stock market and workers intertwine? The other way you might want to think about it is that if you hear about a company that is having lots of challenges, maybe their EBITDA margins are falling, but they might be reporting that they haven't been get off their feet in various areas, or they might be reporting that they've had difficulty hiring workers. People in the capital market will respond by dropping their stock. And so the financial fundamentals of a company are certainly going to be reliant on the kind of workers that they get, how productive those workers are. So less productive workers is going to turn into less revenue, higher costs. So you're going to get lower profits, and then people will not buy those stocks, or they will sell those stocks. And so, I mean, you'll see firms that aren't performing as well will end up, if you do a deep dive on their financials, will probably show higher labor costs. You read their annual reports, they're going to be talking about how they can't get things done because they can't find the right combination of workers. That's a real challenge.
Mm-hmm. One last question for the time being. Maureen asks, what impacts do you forecast for small businesses? I know the sort of labor is going to be one of those.
Yeah.
Many of us have been struggling for the past couple of years and feeling daunted by 2025.
Yeah, so I have a soft spot in my heart for soft businesses, as I mentioned, or maybe I've mentioned, that my spouse has a human resources company, and I do quite a bit of work for her on the side, and at least advising, helping them out, understanding what's happening in the labor markets, and the small businesses are having a very difficult time finding workers that match with what their ideal worker was once upon a time. And it could be the commitment of the workers that they're finding, or it could be the level of performance. And because there are so many openings relative to the number of people who are in the market, people are not committing to a company in the way that they had maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So I think small businesses are very susceptible to people moving around, and then they plant their feet, but they're always looking for the next best thing. Well, it is very difficult for a small business to forecast, plan, put some expansionary policy in place if they do not have, let's say, a solid foundation with respect to their workers. So if they've got a constant, mill of people coming in and coming out and going in and trying to retrain them and what have you, you can never get your feet underneath you. And so it'll just feel like you're constantly spinning. I think that that's one of the biggest challenges for small businesses. It depends on the business as well. The other challenges that I think are most prevalent are the changing consumer aspect of most markets. Consumers we are very fickle, and we're incredibly myopic. So we want what we want, when we want it, how we want it. And if we don't get it that way, then we're going to pivot to something else. I was talking yesterday on, I don't know if it was 11 Alive, about the Teamsters. They voted, unanimous vote, that they could go on strike. I mean, they didn't actually go on strike, but this is the Teamsters that are associated with a couple Amazon fulfillment centers here in Atlanta. And that's a challenge. And they just, those union representatives want better pay and better benefits, and some of them just want better winter jackets. And the reason I bring that up is that the impact of something like that is going to be a bunch of consumers are going to click today on, you're going to see this on Amazon. If you click on this in the next, hour and 37 minutes, it can be delivered by Monday, or it can be delivered by Tuesday, or what have you. And so, if these dates next weekend or next week are important to you, December 24th, December 25th, what have you, then those dates matter in terms of, well, what's on the Amazon website. It's going to be a challenge if the Teamsters actually go on strike. I know that's a big business, but they're facing the same kind of constraints, and that is, labor is fickle, consumers are fickle. I'd be curious if, from a small business perspective, if you're seeing different kind of challenges. Maybe the other challenge that's out there, I think it might be changing a little bit, is access to capital. So access to loans, loanable funds. I think banks are requiring so much more complex business plans these days in order to get a small business loan. Clearly, there are opportunities, but I think that the capital that is available for small businesses is perhaps not as robust as it has been in the past. So I think that's a big challenge as well. Nicola, were there any other questions, or do you want me to just continue with talking about where I think the economy is headed?
There are some other questions, Tom, but why don't you give us a little bit more, and then I'm just compiling the questions, and I'll come on and ask them in a short while.
Sounds great. Thank you. All right. So we've talked about this unemployment rate. I did talk about the GDP. The GDP is growing, and it's growing pretty robustly. We may end up seeing somewhere between a 2.5% and 3.5% annual GDP growth for the year. And that's terrific. That's as good as you can expect from a growing economy, which is why, at the beginning of this, the question is, where's the economy? And I said the Fed isn't going to do anything unless the Fed is seeing that the economy might have some breaks, might be showing a little weakness. If you're just looking at pure fundamentals, GDP and GDP growth, the unemployment rate, then the economy is really quite robust. But when you start looking at inflation and how other let's say consumers are evaluating the current economy, it's showing its weaknesses and its cracks, right? So here's inflation. Inflation, as I mentioned, is hovering right around 2.5%, certainly below the 3% mark that the 2% mark the Fed is looking at. And I had mentioned that we're hovering right around 3% for a while. Now, this is the inflation based on the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. There are producer price indexes. They're all showing pretty much the same level of inflation. But I'm not 100% sure that this is how consumers are evaluating the current state of things. And certainly they're not evaluating it in a time frame that, as an academically trained economist, I might look. So just even at this graph, if you look at sort of this level of inflation since June of 2023, I could draw a line here, between 2.5 and 4, and that would show, let's say, an average level of inflation of about 3%. I could do the same from 2016 to 2020. That would show an average level of inflation around 2%. And if I went back to the previous recession, actually, you'd see a line that was very, very similar to, let's say, our current state, which is, somewhere between, right around 3%. So historically, having an inflation, like an overall inflation around 3%, is not high. It's not high inflation. It's annoying inflation, but it's not high. As a trained economist, that's how I look at it. But I think that a lot of consumers, right, people on the street, if you will, your average whomever, is looking at this and they're picking some point here in 2020, 2019, and saying, wait a minute, we're experiencing 3% inflation. In April of 2020, we had less than 1% inflation. So this is the worst economy ever. Basically, the sky is falling. The economy is terrible, which is not necessarily a great way to look at the economy in terms of some random date that you remember fondly. So this is where I think economists are getting it wrong, and maybe where the Fed is starting to get it right. I'm kind of outguessing myself a little bit, which could be dangerous. But I think that the Fed is seeing that lots of consumers are very unhappy with the current state of the economy. And although the Fed is full of economists that have been classically trained, and they might say, oh, we're doing pretty well. But how can we be doing pretty well and having so many people, a huge portion of the population, say the economy is terrible? Maybe we're evaluating it historically over the last 50 years, and consumers are evaluating it, let's say, more myopically over the last 2 years, over the last 5 years. If that's the case and the Fed ignores them, there would be a potential for consumers to depress their spending, to say, I don't like what's going on with the economy, forget it, I'm going to hold on to my money, I'm not going to buy anything. And then the economy could slip into an economic recession. So I think the Fed is paying attention to the fact that consumers are saying something different than most economists are saying. I don't think that that's a trend that can be put in place forever. I don't think the Fed's responsibility is to take a straw poll and to enact policy based on some popular opinion. But I do think in this case that the Fed is paying closer attention to a, a lot of consumer, a lot of individuals' perception of what the economy is. Okay. And if you look at let's say the price of housing. So here's the median price per square foot of housing. Housing is becoming on the verge of unaffordable for all but maybe, let's say, the top 10, 15% of the population in terms of earnings. Okay. The inflation on homes is, probably 2 to 3 times, 5% annual inflation on the price of homes. So that would be 2x what our current rate of, let's say, consumer inflation is. That's unsustainable. At some point, that could cause an economic recession where people say, I can't find a house, don't know what to do. You could find yourself into an economic recession, a housing bubble, but definitely a drop in consumer spending and consumer sentiment. Also, we look at things like the average price of milk. The inflation on milk is now about zero, and I mean, it has been negative. But these milk prices are never getting back to where they were prior to the pandemic, right? These are, 80 cents, $1.10 higher than they were in, January, February of 2020. These are never going down. Price of eggs, this is never going to go back down to $1.75. There is no market mechanism to force these prices down. Now with avian flus and things that are impacting these egg-laying chickens, it's just not going to happen. Everybody wants these prices to go down to some kind of magical level that they saw. It is virtually impossible to enact policies to just force egg prices to some random price or to force milk prices to some random price. And without getting too political, I saw a interview with President-elect Trump where he was asked specifically about this, and he said, regardless of what's happening, you can't really just change prices just because you want to change prices. That's the market. That's very, very, very tricky. I don't know how many people were watching that or how many people were paying attention to that, but that's important to note. These prices aren't going back just randomly. You can't enact policy to force milk prices back to $2.90. You can't force egg prices to go back to $1.74. Why do I point these things out? Because this is part of the economy that gives people pause. So they look at this and say, yep, the economy's terrible because I'm paying more for eggs, more for milk, more for bread. Everybody's making French toast, evidently. That's what's going on.
And
Nicola,
bacon. And
questions.
bacon.
And bacon. That's right.
Butter, eggs, and bacon.
That's right. That's right.
So we do have some questions that I want to go through.
Absolutely.
So Bob asks, how can addressing supply side disruptions influence inflation more effectively than solely managing excessive demand through monetary measures?
Yeah. So it's a good point. So typically, historically, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. So if we put more money into the system, then you will get an upward pressure in prices. That's historically true. But we did see some inflationary tendencies come out of some of the supply chain elements and kerfuffles that we saw coming out of the pandemic. So making sure that we've got a well functioning supply chain that that doesn't push back on supply. So what you're recognizing is that if you get a supply chain that breaks down at some point and bottlenecks, then what happens is that it becomes increasingly difficult to push that product out there. So a decrease in supply, ceteris paribus, will push prices up. So that's one of the reasons why we got this inflation here. Let me just go back to this inflation level here, right? Rate of inflation. This 9% inflation in 2022. Lots of money, supply chain issues, boom, upward pressure in prices. The supply chain issues are things like making sure that the longshoremen are taken care of, making sure that we've got great roads, but also, I mean, there are definitely, if the government wanted to engage in expansionary fiscal policies or enact policies that were thoughtful and pragmatic and actually addressed elements that are important, they would look at trucking. There's going to be a huge shortage. There may already be a huge shortage of people who are long haul truckers, making sure that that the roads systems were well taken care of. Our interstate systems were well taken care of. Our infrastructure was well taken care of. Those are the kind of things that we can control, that is the US could control with respect to supply chains. So looking at the fundamental elements inside our supply chains and ensuring that they are operating at full efficiency. If I was advising any president, I would have them looking at fiscal policies that addressed those type of elements. Because, as you mentioned, you can't control consumers, but you definitely could make sure that your system is working as efficiently as possible. And maybe some rules around the number of hours you can drive, maybe some tax breaks for trucking companies to pass along more of those wages to workers, which could increase the number of people who are getting into those kind of markets. Maybe some tax breaks for families who drive together. There's lots of interesting policy potential out there, but yeah, it needs to be addressed.
Mhm. Ken asks, in the metro Atlanta housing market, even at the high prices that we have, there's hardly any inventory in the market. And so how do you explain that?
Yeah, this is the housing inventory list right here. So how do I explain the fact that there's very, very little inventory? So couple things. One is that during COVID, there was a huge downturn in the production of new homes, either multifamily or single family residencies, just because it wasn't clear that those homes could sell. There is now also an issue with older families, empty nesters, if you will, who historically would have now turned to something smaller, gone from a house to a condominium, or moved to Arizona or Florida or something of this nature, move in with their kids. That's changing. So instead of a an elderly couple, a couple septenarians or something, 70-year-olds who are moving in with their kids are now moving back in with them. And there's just no incentive to for these empty nesters to sell their home for a couple reasons. One is that if you don't have good inventory, it's hard to push new inventory because people say, well, if I sell my house, where am I going to move to? Second is if you have mortgage rates that are still relatively high, it is challenge for a person to say, well, I've got a mortgage and I'm paying 2 7/8, right? I'm paying right around 3%. Oh, I'd love to jump to a mortgage that I'm paying 6%, even on a smaller house. No, thank you. Just the prospect of that is so unattractive that you might do the cost benefit analysis and say, even though we're in this 3,000 square foot home and there's just the two of us and with our poodle or something, then it still would be cheaper for us to live here than for us to get into a mortgage that is twice the rate that we're currently paying. So inventory is low. If you are looking at current building, I suspect if you're in the Atlanta area, you look around any patch of earth that can be developed into a house, you will see that it is actually being developed into a house everywhere you go. So the inventory is growing, but it's going to be growing very, 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 very slowly. So yeah, as long as inventory is as low as it is, then housing prices will continue to be as high as they are. And I mean, I sort of mentioned this, but this is important. A lot of people think that when the Fed decreases their federal funds target rates, when they drop interest rates, that mortgage rates are automatically going to fall. So mortgage rates move in the same general direction as the federal funds rate, but mortgage rates are based on the mortgage money market, which is a separate market than the federal funds market. And so here we're seeing these mortgage rates actually, after the Fed dropped their discount rate target by 50 basis points, mortgage rates actually went up. And so I talked to the news a bunch about this. I said, look, you forget that this blue line, which is the intersection between the supply and demand for loanable funds for mortgages, is not the same as the supply and demand for funds for banks to make loans. This is its own little market. And so the supply and demand is what determines this interest rate. And this interest rate doesn't have to follow the federal funds rate lockstep. So people are a little bit annoyed that the mortgage rate, credit card rates aren't falling. There's no incentive for credit card companies to drop their rates. They're actually increasing their rates. Same thing with mortgages. There's no incentive for the market to work the same direction as the federal funds market is. So this is something that is going to be problematic. I think that the housing issue is going to be, the issue, probably one of two issues for 2025, right?
Mhm.
The other issue is that we're going to run out of money here in a second if the government doesn't do something. And that could make our January very, very unpleasant.
Hannah has a question, and I think two other things that are going to make or that are making 2025 perhaps unpleasant. Should the growing cost of healthcare and education debt be a significant economic concern for us?
Yes. Yes. I can just leave it like that. But I mean, I'm sure you. So the healthcare, I think, is a real problem. The cost of healthcare is the cost of healthcare for companies is a very big, big element of their budget. And so, I mean, if you pour over, some companies are actually quite transparent with respect to where they're spending their money. So your FedExes, if you will, and some other companies that report some really detailed P&Ls. These companies are showing that their healthcare costs are significant. And we just even think about these Teamsters who are vote. They aren't on a strike, but they voted for a strike. what they're looking for are better benefits package and probably a different kind of healthcare coverage, at least in terms of the share of their own expenses. So what will happen is a company will get their new healthcare quotes from Aetna or whomever, Blue Cross, in September, and then they'll try to figure out, okay, we're going to have open enrollment in October, November. How much of these new expenses are we going to cover of our employees, and how much are they going to cover? And then, okay, if we're not covering enough, is it possible that we could have employees who we have a mass exodus of employees who are leaving us, going someplace else? So yeah, it's a huge issue. It's such a big, big market, and it's such a mess. There is no easy fix for this. But I think smaller companies in particular are very aware that these costs could drive them out of business. What was the second thing that it was healthcare costs and
Education debt.
education debt. Yeah, that's a challenge. That's definitely a challenge. I do think a lot more younger individuals are evaluating what the value of a college education is and whether they need to be taking out as many loans as they have been. I don't know what the process is to then clear that debt. That debt is going to be looming over people the way that the laws are written about that debt. That debt can't be forgiven if you are in bankruptcy. Um, so and a sort of universal forgiveness of that debt did not prove to be very popular. There was a lot of pushback with respect to universal forgiveness of certain levels of that debt. If they did, that would clear up a huge amount of capital, and you could get amazing, amazing economic growth by clearing up that debt. I think that economically, that would be an amazing jolt to the economy, especially if, let's say, you cleared up the debt if it was in conjunction with starting a new business or filing patents. There are things that you could do to tie up that kind of debt, that is to clear that debt, that would actually be very, very good for the economy. And right now it's definitely putting pressure on lots of younger individuals.
Mm-hmm. So, Tom, we've got time, I think, for one very quick last question.
Okay.
And I don't think I think it's going to be a long answer, though. Ken
Oh,
asks, as the healthcare costs are going up, the health insurance premiums are going to be high, but health insurance companies are making profits in the billions. Is there a practical solution to fix this unbalanced scenario?
so the unbalanced part and the scenario part. So this is a challenge. So I mean, I work for a business school, and I can see the benefits of capitalism. So I think there's a good reason for why this is going to be a longer answer. So here's how I talk to my students about capitalism, and here's how I think about capitalism. And I think it's important to notice this. So I work at a business school named after a former CEO of Coca-Cola, Roberto C. So here's somebody who fully understood the value of capitalism and was able to use sound economic principles to generate considerable wealth for the Coca-Cola company, which served not only Coca-Cola and the board of directors and stockholders, but himself. And so he took full advantage of what capitalism had to offer, but then he took the benefits of that capitalism and turned it into the benefits of thousands of my students, which I think is one of the best elements of capitalism, is that it gives you the opportunity to accumulate huge amounts of wealth and then to turn around and do amazing things with that wealth. There's no other system that truly offers that avenue. And because I'm the beneficiary of that particular avenue, I certainly like that avenue. Here's the problem, and here's one of the problems with this from a sort of a free markets perspective, is that if you try to tell an insurance company, a healthcare company, but they can't make the profits that they want to make, then will they change the level of service? Maybe the level of service isn't that good to begin with. So will it get worse? How do you mandate a level of service in something like healthcare? It's very, very, very challenging. How do you mandate a level of profitability? The challenge that I often face is with students and with community members when they say, darn, but I mean, do they have to make that much profit? I mean, their profit is so ridiculously large. Does it have to be that much? I mean, aren't they willing to take some of that and put it back into their own operating, pay nurses better, pay their physicians better, offer better cadre of services? I would like to say yes, but the individuals who are pushing that system go all the way down to, let's say, stockholder, who I want to see the highest EBITDA returns of a company because that's what generates wealth and equity in those markets. So there's no simple solution because a lot of those companies are publicly traded, and stockholders like myself and maybe like yourself also want to see the benefits of an increased market, right? I mean, I'm hoping to retire someday. So I'm hoping that the value of the stock market and equities continues to explode so that I'll have a robust a robust capital stash to retire on. That's challenging. How do you tell a
So
company they shouldn't profit or
it
profit as much as
certainly
they want
make
to?
it certainly makes an interesting conversation around the dinner table, particularly with the different generations that with different perspectives.
Yeah. I
Tom,
would
we
I would recommend everybody just talk about how bad the Bears are. That's an easy one. Everybody can agree. You're gonna have a lot of turkey or something else, and just say like, oh, have you ever seen a team find a new way to lose? That's such a fun conversation as a Bears fan. So, and there will be no arguments. Your entire family will agree that the Bears are absolutely terrible.
Tom, thank you so much. Heather, over to you for a quick
For a quick closing, yes. Thank you so much. There we go.
You might need to unshare.
I think I got it. We set? Yeah. Can you all see my slides? Yes. Thank you so much, Nicola, as always, for leading this and for the Q&A. And Tom, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. This is very enlightening, somewhat sobering, but always such great information to hear. So thank you. So my name is Heather Dufault, and I'm part of the open enrollment team at the Goizueta Business School, and we certainly appreciate you sharing your morning with us. I just want to take a quick minute here as we close out 2024. I can't believe I'm saying this. Where did the year go? Just to talk about what's coming up next in our BOB series. We are taking January 2nd off. I hope you are as well. And we will be back on January 16th. With the mechanics of shareholder democracy. What happens when the status quo is challenged in corporate boardrooms with Professor Wee. So we hope you'll join us for that. And then also, as Nicola mentioned early on, I want to take an opportunity just to talk about if you are looking in 2025 for ways to build or refine your skills, please join us. We have a series of courses, short courses, asynchronous courses that are available. Coming up in the spring, we have our Business of Healthcare certificate courses. These are, if you are interested in healthcare and you want to learn about the business side of medicine or innovation and impact change, please join us. We also have a new suite of asynchronous digital enablement programs. Our managerial leadership program. This is an intensive 5-day program. It's designed to help you build leadership skills and empower your team. And then additionally, look for our popular executive communication and leadership presence and our leveraging AI for business courses. Please reach out to the email on the screen if you're interested in learning more about any of those, and we will have information in the chat as well. Registration is still open. So again, thank you so much for spending your morning with us. Nicola, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Thank you, Heather. And I just want to say, wishing you all a very, very happy, peaceful, joyful, restful holiday season from Emory Executive Education and Goizueta Business School. Thank you to my team for making this happen. These business over breakfasts happen twice a month, and it's a huge, I think, a huge value to our community, to our extended Emory community, and I really want to thank the team for making this happen. It's not trivial, and I understand that. Also to Tom for a great session today, and for being the instigator and the prompt back in 2020 to make this all happen. And then also to all of the participants, and we're getting to know your names, and we feel like you're a part of the family. So thank you for turning up, for your questions, for your engagement. Please reach out to friends and colleagues and let them know about this, because it's always wonderful to have folks show up and learn with us. So happy holidays. Looking forward to seeing you and engaging with you all back in January. Wishing you a wonderful, wonderful holiday season, and 2025 is a wonderful year for you. Bye, everybody.